Hey there, boys and girls. Welcome to your Edpuzzle homework tonight, dealing with explaining lesson 9.2. So this is going to be a little different than what we normally do. I'm going to be walking you through how to solve some of the problems in your workbook, but it won't be a very long video as we're going to move through it pretty quick. All right, so explaining lesson 9.2. So obviously we're on lesson 9.2. So if you have not turned to pages 322 and 323 in your workbook, please do so now. All right, and we are going to focus on page 322 to begin with. All right, so we're going to kind of walk through some things there. So what we're going to be doing in lesson 9.2 is we're going to be comparing different fractions that have different numerators and different denominators. Okay, but they are going to be similar in some sense, and we'll talk more about that in this video and a little bit in another video later on. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at here in our step in is it says the top strip is worth 1 whole. So we know from the beginning over here in my fraction wall on this side, all the way across the top till this side, that's 1 whole. And I can see that it's 1 whole because it's not cut into any smaller pieces. I notice as I work my way down the layers or down the strips, I notice that they're getting cut into more and more pieces as I'm working my way down. And if we think about a fraction, that kind of makes a lot of sense because if I look at this fraction here that says 1/3, right, we know that a numerator tells us, yeah, that tells us how many pieces we have. So right here I would have 1 piece. And the denominator on the bottom tells us, yeah, how many pieces make the whole thing. So we notice it takes 3 pieces to equal 1 whole or to match the thing on the top, which is 1 whole. Okay, and we're going to be using that understanding as we move forward. So what we're going to be doing a lot of today is we're going to be using our fraction wall to help us compare and see which fractions are bigger or greater, or which ones might be smaller or less, or maybe even they might be equal. Okay, so our first one here says 1/2 or 1/5, and it wants to know which one is greater. And then obviously we're going to be doing a lot of our deciding today by looking at our model or looking at our fraction wall. So the first fraction they're showing me is 1/2. So I know up here on my fraction wall I have to go shade in or show or mark 1/2. So I know 1/2 ends right there because notice this is where it began, or 1/5. So now I have to find 1/5 on my fraction wall. So not here, that's 1/3, that's 1/4, 1/5 would be right here. And notice they both start at the same point. They start at the beginning of my wall, but 1/2 extends out a lot farther than 1/5. So that means, yeah, that means 1/2 is greater or takes up more space than 1/5. Nice job. Now, the other one I want you to kind of look at here is this next one here that says 1/8 or 1/10. But if we notice, if we look at our fraction wall, we don't have eighths or tenths on it. So we really have to kind of use a different understanding, or this kind of goes back to the idea of the pizza party we talked about earlier in the year. So if we're trying to figure out which is bigger, 1/8 or 1/10, notice here I've got 2 whole pizzas that have not been cut into any pieces. Okay, because what we talked about is if I've only got 1 person at my pizza party, I don't need to cut this thing up. That's a really big piece. Just like back here in my book, this strip at the top was really big because it wasn't cut into any pieces either. All right, but if I'm trying to figure out which is bigger, I could cut them into the pieces they show. So this whole has to be cut into 8 pieces because that's what my denominator tells me. And this one has to be cut into 10 pieces because my denominator over here says a 10. Now when I look at this, I can see, well, eighths, if this is the size of 1/8 and this is the size of 1/10, I can see that eighths take up more space than tenths, don't they? Yeah, so I know 1/8 would be bigger. Or it goes back to what we talked about earlier in the year. The bigger that denominator becomes, the smaller your pieces have to become too, because you have to cut the pizza or you have to cut the whole thing up into more pieces, which means they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So think if this said 1/100th, that would mean I'd have to cut this whole thing into 100 pieces, which means the pieces are going to be really, really small because of how big my denominator is. Okay, that's something we're going to talk more about in another video, not so much today. Really what we're going to be doing in today's video is we're going to be using that fraction wall to help us solve our problems. Okay, so now it's going to be your turn. So I'm going to have you go through and I'm going to have you solve some problems in your workbook. and you're going to be using that fraction wall up on page 323 to help you. Okay, so you're responsible for right now, like the problems in your video that you have to do. You're going to do problem number 2, and you're going to do problem number 3. And what problem number 2 is telling you is it says, obviously the top strip up here is one hole. Now notice if this is one hole, that means I have enough up here to make one hole and another hole, which would be 2 holes. Okay. And then I've still got all my fractions down below that have been cut up. So again, if this is one hole from beginning to right here, notice this says 1/2 and 2/2. That makes sense because 2/2 would take up the same amount of space as one hole. Okay, so what they want you to do is they want you to compare the fractions down below. So the first one I'll help you with is A. It says 3/12. So I need to come up here and find 3/12. So I would shade in, or I would see how far out 3/12 go. Okay, so I know it goes that far. And the other fraction let's compare to is 1/3. So if I'm looking up here and I'm going to figure out how far 1/3 goes. Now it's not a whole lot more, but 1/3 does go farther than 3/12. So I know my alligator would eat the bigger one, so it would eat 1/3. Okay, so you're going to use your fraction wall to help you with the rest of these on this page. And then when you're ready for problem number 3 down here, okay, they want you to come up with 3 fractions that are in between the 2 that they give you. Okay, so the first one they say is they want fractions that are greater than 3/4, but less than 14/12. So if I'm looking up here at my fraction wall, 3/4 is going to start here, and it's going to extend out 1 piece, 2 piece, 3 pieces. So they want it to be bigger than that, but they don't want it to go more than 14/12. So I know I'm going to color in 12/12 really quick because that would be one hole. And then I'm going to go 2 extra because that would be 14. So I need to find up here on my fraction wall 3 fractions that are in between 3/4 and 14/12. And as you can see, there are a lot of fractions that would end in between those two. So you're going to do that for A, and you're going to also do the same thing for B, except you're going to be using different numbers or different fractions. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'll be more than happy to help you. Have a good night. Make smart choices.